Hello there lovely people, it's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and today it is finally time to review Resident Evil Revelations Collection for the Switch. This review was originally written by the wonderful John Mundy and has been adapted for video by me. But anyway, enough waffling, let's dive right into things. Very much like one of its infamous boss battles, the Resident Evil series keeps mutating into different shapes. It also has the uncanny ability of getting back up just when you think it's just about dead. Which brings us to the Resident Evil Revelations Collection, a loose splicing together of two well-regarded franchise spin-offs from earlier in the decade. Resident Evil Revelations and Resident Evil Revelations 2 are presented here on the Switch as a package, or at least they are in North America, where a physical release rolls them together somewhat crudely. Annoyingly, only the first game is on the cartridge, with a code for the sequel prompting a whopping 26 GB download. They are also coming to the eShop as individual downloads at tempting prices too, and that's the only way you're going to get them in Europe. Most of the differences between the games were determined many years ago by the original choice of platforms. For example, the first Revelations was made for the Nintendo 3DS, if you can believe it. If you weren't around at the time, if you were, you probably could, and released back in 2012, whilst Revelations 2 was a cross-generational console game that launched 3 years later. And today, the first game remains a very good handheld Resident Evil, whilst the second game remains a very good console Resident Evil. And it's just a little bit too appropriate that the two games would come together on this system that's trying to straddle the line between the two. Everyday protagonist Jill Valentine takes the leading role in the very first game, as she investigates a mutant-infused cruise ship. Because you do. Mixing fusty ocean liner fittings with state-of-the-art maintenance systems and creaking metal gantries, the Queen Zenobia is a worthy and refreshing fill-in for all the haunted mansions that have become such a series staple. And yes, there are zombie fish. You can stop worrying. Valentine has the non-playable partner to hand in the solidly built Parker, who provides dim observations and even less helpful combat interventions throughout the game. His main purpose seems to be to deliver the hammy story forward and lay out your present goal, which typically involves getting to a location and flipping a switch or finding a key to access another part of the ship. It's not all about this duo though. Your perspective will frequently shift to a different pairing, namely Chris Redfield and the cringe-inducingly flirtatious Jessica. They start out investigating a different environment entirely, and the sections are generally more action-based with plentiful ammo as you fend off waves of mutated beasts. The controls have a certain sluggishness that series fans will be warmly familiar with and feels entirely deliberate. Whoever you're controlling, you're not quick and you're not agile, which greatly adds to the tension in encounters with your mutated beasties. Although you're thankfully spared the fixed perspective and vague aiming of the earliest games. And praise be, it's possible to move and shoot simultaneously by using the ZL and ZR button together. The main novelty to Revelations' control system is the Genesis thing. Holding L lets you scan your environment for points of interest, whether they be fallen mutants or just general bits and bobs around the ship, not entirely dissimilar to that of the Metroid Prime series. The original game was obviously built to be a portable experience, and it remains a very fine game to play on the Switch in handheld mode. Each episode is relatively snappy to play through, often lasting just 10 to 20 minutes, and you'll get a helpful previously cutscene at the beginning of every restart. Meanwhile, the game's graphics, whilst perfectly fine and sharpened up for more capable hardware, are far better suited to be used on a smaller display where the basic textures and simple geometry are less noticeable. There are instances where it looks really good on the big screen, but more often than not, again, the simple textures somewhat let it down. Which brings us to Resident Evil Revelations 2, which is arguably the more interesting game for the Switch owners. I mean, this is the first time we've seen it on a Nintendo console, for some reason foregoing the Wii U, probably because it was the Wii U. Beyond that, it's just outright a better game than Revelations. It's sharper, deeper, with a more sophisticated and self-aware plot, richer level design, and punchier combat. Revelations 2 emulates the first game's episodic structure, but the episodes are longer and more varied and more sort of console-y. This time the leading role goes to Claire Redfield, as she finds herself imprisoned on a remote island with the help from her rookie colleague, Moira Burton. Fans of the series may well recognize the Burton name, as Barry Burton himself fills the second lead slot in alternating episodes as he investigates the disappearance of his estranged daughter. And it's Barry's story that is the unexpected delight here, his world-weary but fiercely protective nature playing nicely against his vulnerable but gifted companion. There's also definitely something of The Last of Us to these Barry-Natalia sections, both in tone and gameplay, with moments of tense stealth interspersed with flashes of brutal violence in an abandoned industrial environment. And the secondary characters are far more useful in Revelations 2 than they ever were in Revelations 1. Each one of them has completely different skill sets. For example, Moira is almost useless in a direct fight, but can use her torch to uncover hidden loot and blind enemies, and can crowbar open boxes and nailed shut doors. Natalia, on the other hand, can use her powers to see enemies through walls and locate hidden items, whilst her powers are also key to some truly hair-raising encounters with invisible enemies. She's also small enough to squeeze through holes in walls, which can be useful. Part of the appeal of this game is making a mental note of level elements that you know your current pair can't access, and returning to it in the next episode with characters who can. In many cases, the locations have been affected by time and circumstance, and your path through them is rarely predictable. You can even play the entire campaign in local split-screen multiplayer, though the second player will have to be content with clumsy melee combat and a lot of running when the guts start flying. The game's murky palette means that it can also be pretty tough to play cooperatively on the Switch's screen itself. In general technical terms as well, Resident Evil Revelations 2 is on a much higher level than the original. The lighting effects, while certainly nothing to set the world on fire, are much more effective at setting a creepy mood, whilst the textures are more varied and the levels stretch out far more expansively. It also feels a little bit tighter in the hands, which is most likely a result of the game being built with a traditional controller in mind rather than a handheld console reliant on quirky bits and bobs in the optional second circle pad. Both games seriously benefit from the addition of motion controls though. Much like the Wii remaster of Resident Evil 4, you can opt to use the right Joy-Con to aim your weapons. It takes a little bit of getting used to unless you've played some serious amount of Splatoon 2 for some reason, and it perhaps doesn't feel quite as one-to-one responsive as that aforementioned game, but it undoubtedly helps with lining up headshots. It's also worth pointing out that you're getting a lot more than just your standard Resident Evil Revelations 1 and Resident Evil Revelations 2. You've got a bumload of extra costumes, levels, and other unlockables for both games, and you're also getting the complete raid mode for both entries. These raid sections are essentially generously proportioned shooting galleries, allowing you and a friend or a stranger via online matchmaking to run through a bunch of custom levels, blasting away at various zombie enemies. Whether you take to this mode or not probably depends on your view of the series' gunplay, but it potentially adds a vast amount of additional content to two already fantastically replayable campaigns. Resident Evil Revelations Collection isn't really a collection as such. There's no significant connective tissue between these two distinct games beyond a few common elements and a shared fictional history. It would have been nice to see some kind of effort put into presenting a unified front with a common UI and synced up approach to controls. A certain sense of porting laziness aside though, these are two fine entries that stand proud in the storied franchise. The original Revelations was a great 3DS game at the time, and it remains a surprisingly solid, refreshingly breezy experience here on Switch. Revelations 2 is where it's really at though. This is a full-fat Resident Evil experience with a neat partner system and some terrifyingly tense set pieces. There's a strong case to be made that you could simply ignore the original game and just buy this prime slab of survival horror, but completionists won't be disappointed either way.